They say, well, this is just one of those things that happen. We all have to sit down and wait and ride it out. Now that's all okay for them because the financial advisors are still getting a percentage of my superannuation, but actually they are working for me and losing my money. If I worked for my previous boss and didn't perform and lost money, I certainly wouldn't have a job.
And unless we change behaviour and the way things are done, then this will just happen again.
And if there's anything that we've got to learn out of all this is that if we don't get it, if we don't understand it, if the balance sheet doesn't make sense, then don't invest in it.
Basically, if the economy's growing at 4 to 5% and super fund returns, the markets, the property market is showing returns of 10 to 15% year on year on year, there is going to be a correction. There is going to be a correction.
The real lessons are what caused the crisis in the first place. Okay, what caused this to happen? Things like perverse incentives, very poor lending standards when it came to lending and giving mortgages to people, because people had the incentive to lend and take high-risk mortgages because they were getting paid for it. And obviously the lack of regulatory oversight.
So managing counterparty risks, liquidity risks, those sorts of things are going to be more important, I think, than in the past.
I think super will come through unscathed. Look, there will be some changes around the edges, but there's a lot of investment that's gone into developing this system. I mean, it leads the world in providing an opportunity for working people to live a retirement with some sort of adequate super benefit. And I just think that it's too strong to wilter under the current pressure.
It all reminds me, actually, of when I was a student in the time of the McCarthyite era, long ago. We used to sing a little song about who's going to investigate the guy who investigates me. And until we start investigating the ratings agencies and controlling them and making them responsible for what they do, then we're always going to have problems.
But what I would be very, very concerned about is if the government tried to use the veil of the global financial crisis to try and, if you like, re-skew our superannuation system.
For many people in industry super, this is really the first serious downturn that they've seen. I recall clearly the '87 crash, but there weren't a lot of industry super funds around in '87. I mean, this is a whole new experience for the people. We've got to learn from this, and I think the positive coming out of this is that a lot of people will be more focused on risk management and on compliance and all the other things you need to do to protect your organisation in a negative environment.
Where there is a focus on getting us out of the short-term crisis, which we need to do, but not enough focus on the long term and what we've got on the horizon. And we really do need to have a plan. I mean, it's about keeping your head and having a plan.
Michael Dwyer's my name. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of First State Super, and it's my pleasure to chair this afternoon's session. The title of the plenary number 10 is What Have We Learnt and What Happens When Tomorrow Comes? We have invited two very eminent speakers to join with us, people you would be well known to you. We have Rob Prugue and Jack Gray. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome our speaker, the CEO of Lazard, Rob Prugue.
The subject matter is a rather difficult one. What have we learned? It's difficult because, one, it presupposes that we are able to identify the mistakes that we made. And two, it's one of those horrible questions that no matter what you answer, they always comes out wrong. In the end, of course, we're all students, and of course, we're all still learning. To quote one of my favorite singers, Eartha Kitt, she said, "My life is lived as a student. My tombstone will be my diploma." So, using that as a starting block, I thought, how do I actually address this very question? What have we learned? So I wanted to use an analogy in answering it. An analogy I wanted to use was basically the 7 deadly sins. And I actually thought about using the 7 deadly sins off an obituary I read in the London Times. But the obituary wasn't of a person, but rather the death of common sense. If you have a chance, I strongly encourage you to have a read of it. So let's start with the first one, the most interesting one in many ways, lust. How do you convey that in the world of investments and funds management? Well, in my opinion, it's wanting something you can't have. and how that relates to ethics and governance. In other words, what we ask of others is obviously high and demanding, but do we necessarily ask it in ourselves? Do we employ the same yardsticks which defines good governance versus bad governance internally? Do we employ the same yardsticks which defines a well-run machine internally as we do when we seek out a good company or a good investment? Probably this is where, again, we fall perhaps short. The second one, a little bit more interesting perhaps, is gluttony. I think gluttony is probably more prevalent and tied to economies of scale, because the larger you are, the absolute number may still be quite large, but as far as your management expense or how it relates to running your own business becomes relatively small. The management is obviously, the expense ratio is something that's looked at by many. This expense can either be an absolute cost, but sometimes and more often than not, it can be embedded within the investment vehicle to which we buy. Case in point, fund of funds. Many fund of funds for their researcher course charge the same sort of management fees and performance fees that the managed hedge funds may actually demand. And so when you put it all together in an investment trust, sometimes these investment trusts can actually hide the true embedded management costs of something. So the gluttony is in some ways, again, related to the expense, and in my opinion, can be more often hidden through the economies of scale. The larger firms are able to put it through because as a percentage, the way the expense ratios are conveyed looks rather small, whereas smaller plans or smaller funds have less room to which they can maneuver themselves. The third one is a rather interesting one, and one close to my heart, and that's greed. It's close to my heart because, again, I think it's a mismatch of the way our industry has gone in the last 20 to 30 years. And what I mean by that is we've become consumed in the world of wealth accumulation, versus perhaps what the true objective of any pension plan is wealth immunization or wealth preservation. What I mean by the wealth accumulation, again, is we're all chasing the higher rate of return. As asset class go quite up, and the importance of many league tables, be it league tables of fund products or league tables of plans themselves and how they compare. More often than not, they can be a mismatch of one fund relative to another. One fund may be deemed good because that fund delivered a 3% outperformance over a 5-year cycle versus another fund which underperformed by 5%. Was the fund that delivered 3% more necessarily a superior one? Does it necessarily match the risk profile of which you'd want to embrace? Also, greed is one that's a human factor, of course, and it's one that's heavily influenced, certainly in times of disarray such as now, by fear. It can influence people in this opposite sense of the fear of losing money, to perhaps mismatching, again, their objective versus their target of wealth immunization. Isn't it interesting? Because when you talk about a balanced fund, the actuary will always talk of a balanced fund in the form of CPI plus or 1 in 7 years of negative returns, et cetera, et cetera. But more often than not, it's defined by what the asset allocation actually is. And more typically than not, it's a rather fixed static asset allocation rather than one that's commensurate with the risk and return profile to which we're trying to outperform. My biggest fear of this greed element is not so much that the mismatch of the risk profile, but the worst case scenario is a run on super funds. No, not a run on super funds as you would expect from a bank where people line up and queue up, as I've seen, unfortunately, in Hong Kong where people want to draw their money out, but a run where people choose under the choice environment a way to opt out of a balanced fund in favor of a cash fund. Imagine the implications this has on our industry, not just on providers such as ourselves, but even asset consultants. What is the need of an asset consultant if the choice is purely cash? The next one is sloth. I think this is a horseshoe-shaped evil. What I mean by that, on the one end, you have the highly liquid easily transferable asset classes. The old Wall Street waltz, if you like. If you get it wrong, you leave. If something doesn't work out, you call your broker, you sell the share, or if the manager failed to meet your expectations and it's relatively liquid asset class, you can just tell your asset consultant to please pull the plug and switch to another fund. Conversely, the other end of this evil is, I would argue, the complexity or illiquidity. Sometimes the transparency that we demand, if you like, from a liquid asset class is less prevalent in the less liquid and the more exotic asset classes. And the sloth there comes in where we lack the transparency. We may ask for more of it, but we don't get it. And so the sloth comes in perhaps by just utilizing a return profile over a time period without truly understanding or truly perhaps researching the underlying assets embedded within that return profile, how much bet was actually done. The danger here, unlike the liquid asset class, of course, is that more often than not, in many of these illiquid assets, you're locked in. And you're locked into funding requirements, and you're locked into the other obligations that are attached to such illiquid asset classes. The fifth one is envy. This is a rather neat one, the grass is greener type argument. I call this really more endowment envy. I've always argued that David Swensen should get royalties from his book from some of the illiquid managers. Because after, of course, that book came out, there was a huge interest in, again, some of the private equities and some of the other liquids. Does it mean that they were a bad investment? Of course not. But there was perhaps a damage being there that people lumped in all managers, all providers of these exotics as being equal. Well, I'm a firm believer that in any asset class, there's a beta and there's an alpha. Within that alpha, there's positive alpha and negative alpha. And the same is true with many of the liquid asset classes. But yet again, we lump it all together as being one that's favorable. But is it? Are all illiquid providers favorable? Are all illiquid providers of similar caliber? Or, like in other liquid asset classes, are some better than others? We do, again, research the situation. We demand a transparency in the liquid asset classes to be able to decipher that. But the envy argument, the fact that some very high-profile endowments and their success given this allocation towards a liquid in this match has perhaps led some to believe that the grass is actually greener on the other side. Many insurance companies, of course, will tell you otherwise. Back in the 1970s, many insurance companies were heavy investors at what was then called venture capital, not too dissimilar. And they learned the importance of matching the cash flow needs with that of your investment profile. So the envy is something that can perhaps be obviously one of the sins. Wrath, number 6. This is a little bit more difficult. The obvious definition of wrath is anger, but actually twist it a little bit and call it self-denial. If you like, drinking one's own Kool-Aid. Believing the story that we actually have of what we say. If you like, a long-term goals. We talk about the long-term goals. We talk about the importance that we're managing a portfolio and immunizing it towards a CPI plus. But inevitably, we ask ourselves the same question. How was your performance this last quarter? What did the stock price do in this last quarter? There's a mismatch. The self-denial where we talk one thing but perhaps act in another manner. The last one I want to cover is 7, is number pride. This is an interesting one because, as a Latino, pride is obviously very close to my heart. But I remember telling the people once, I spoke at ASFA, and I said, I've lived a very fortunate life. I'm a son of a diplomat, and I've chosen a career that has me traveling around the world. And of all the beautiful places I've been to, not once have I ever come across a statue of a fund manager. And that's actually quite important in this new age of demagoguery. That is it, isn't it? Demagoguery. This belief, why is it that our industry has this belief of self-importance? Why is it that our industry is usually first off mark for many young MBAs? What's wrong with chemical engineering? What's wrong with pharmacy? What's wrong with the many other lucrative industries? Why can't they attract the same caliber of people? We're surrounded by very intelligent. Don Luke said it best. As you know, when he moved on, he said the one thing he misses most is the access to really intelligent and driven people. But we believe this thing, don't we? This belief of self-importance. We want to. We're all very proud individuals. We are very proud of our achievements. But are we necessarily any more important in our contribution to humanity? Let me leave you with one final thought. If you retire, there are two things that are very important to you, without a doubt: your wealth and your health. So if you believe that, then surely you would agree with me that health insurance is quite important. Okay? And we go to conferences many times over the years, and we ask ourselves, we all echo each other by saying we can't believe the members don't want to learn more or don't understand more, so we try investor education. We try to match their needs versus the profile. We do our best to try to do that. And it's no less important or no less relevant, but it's something that we obviously talk about. Somewhere in a mirror world, there's a similar conference by health insurance officials. They're equally asking themselves, why don't people really care to investigate what kind of health insurance they choose? There's 5 different kinds of health insurance. Do they have the right one? Why don't they care to investigate whether this provider is stronger relative to the other provider? Now, I said mirror one another. The big difference, though, of course, is that in our industry, we tend to have our conferences in very nice places. In the health industry ones, perhaps not. Is it less important? Is it less relevant to someone who's retiring? We've been very fortunate that Paul Keating introduced the superannuation schemes when he did, a time of basically a 30-year long and prolonged bull market. Imagine if Paul Keating wasn't Australian, but actually Japanese. Imagine if Paul Keating introduced superannuation in Japan in 1990. Back in 1990, the Nikkei was, roughly speaking, 39,000. Today, it's 8,000. You and I discussed our long-term expectations pre the global financial crisis as 8-9%. Japanese do the same, only with a negative in front of it. They're accustomed to prolonged periods of deflation, of asset values going down. So let me leave you with 2 questions of this idea of self-importance. Firstly, question number 1, what do you think the average asset allocation for a balanced option would look like in Japan? 70-30? By the way, which is the 70, bonds or equities? Second question I want to leave you with is, given the world of choice, where do you think the average member would have their money? In a balanced option or in a cash option? And if it is a cash option, is this something we should be concerned about, given our long-term objectives? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Jack, just before I allow you to speak, I shouldn't share this with you because Jack told me confidentially, but I will. We were having a coffee the other night and Jack gets a head of steam up about what he called institutional stealing. And in the process of doing that, and after his 3rd cup of coffee, he said, "To be honest, Michael, I nearly went off the rails when I was much younger." I said, "You went off the rails?" He said, "Yes." He said, I was somewhat of a thief myself in the early days. I thought, well, sometimes if you've hired him as a manager in recent times, you might still think he sort of has some of those attributes. But Jack, could you explain that to us, please?
It was a story I told the ethics class, because I think in talking about ethics and trying to encourage ethical behaviour, you have to come clean about your own lack of ethical behaviour, of which we are all guilty in varying degrees. This wasn't actually really one of them, because this happened when I was 15, and therefore that wasn't me. That's rationalisation number 1, but you'll hear some more. At the grand old age of 15, I was, I should say, a very difficult and potentially violent kid in fights, and I actually got shot once. and stealing was part of the aim of the game. Stealing, why? Not to get wealthy, but stealing because it was fun. It was adrenaline rush. And I used to steal books. Now, being an ethical individual, I had lots of standards. So I never stole books from libraries. I did not steal books from small bookshops, only from the large bookshops. And I only stole books that I really needed. And so my justification there was a utilitarian one, that the world is better off if I steal this book because I will learn something and that'll add more than it does sitting on a dry shelf somewhere. So I had a totally ethical justification for it. And then at one stage it sort of dawned on me, which is where my criminal career ended, it dawned on me that things had got a little out of hand because I was in a contest with a friend who was also 15 to see how many copies of Wuthering Heights we could steal in one go. And I got to tell you, I came second. I only got 15 in one go. And I realised there was something a little wrong, and even at the age of 15 I could appreciate that. The story, interestingly, is not dissimilar to Bernie Madoff. It is too easy to say he was greedy. Greed is part of it. It's much more than that. It's the adrenaline rush of doing something illicit. He was doing this and getting away with it, and that is damn exciting. I've got to tell you, as a 15-year-old, it is a thrill to do that. And I think that is the case. Madoff found it very exciting to keep doing this stuff, regardless of ethics or anything else. And that's what makes it hard to stop, not just the greed factor. Madoff, I should say, is a metaphor for everything that's gone on. If you think about what he did, first of all, if you're going to rip someone off, do it in a really big way. Don't steal 10 grand, steal 50 billion, because no one will believe you actually did it. And if you're going to lie, tell a really big lie like Hitler did, because everyone will believe that. There was, I think Mavis spoke about McCarthy. You remember McCarthy used to wave a piece of paper in his hand and say, I have here the names of 6 members of the State Department who belong to the Communist Party. And it was his laundry list. And nobody ever challenged it because, God, he wouldn't lie about a thing like that. So Madoff understood that. He also understood how the respect, the unfortunate respect that we pay people in the finance industry carries a lot of weight. They have status and they far beyond what they add, and they use that status and glamour to extract people's money, hard-earned money from them, and he did that very effectively. The other thing he did, he also played on the social and sociological aspects of our behaviour by playing on a group of which he was a member. And we all trust people who are like ourselves. There's probably something very tribal in that. And so he played on the rich Jewish set in Westchester and Florida. And of course, he was one of them, so he's never going to rip us off. He might rip someone else off, but not us. That was a key part, and there was a Hispanic Ponzi scheme too that played on the same thing. He used his authority. We respect authority too much, particularly in this industry. Bernard L. Madoff. He was chairman of NASDAQ. Obviously, he's okay. We can trust him. He played on our desire for certainty, passionate desire for certainty. Remember, he didn't offer huge returns, he just offered steady returns. And as Hegel said, we are so desirous of certainty, we will sacrifice conscience and consciousness for it. And many people did that. And then finally, there were people who knew what was going on. Markopoulos, the Boston accountant, wrote a 12-page document to the SEC, and it was ignored. People knew what was going on, but they ignored it. That is exactly what happened here. There is no excuse. We knew what was going to happen. There were plenty of people who were screaming about what was happening. When I was at GMO, we were. We weren't the only ones. Steve Roach was doing that. The Bank of International Settlements was doing that. There were plenty of people saying, this is going to end badly and you should do something. And very few, there were some funds who did. There were some funds who hedged against this possibility in a big way, and they did very well. And to stay with the herd on the grounds that it ain't going to happen, I think everyone's responsible for that. It is not just those on Wall Street, the crooks on Wall Street, who are responsible. The underlying root cause that people haven't addressed yet is really a set of beliefs that we have called economic rationalism, neoliberalism, market fundamentalism. Those sets of beliefs which came about, they were started to be developed in the University of Chicago in the 50s and 60s and reached a peak in the late 70s. The works of Hayek and of Friedman, of course, and Becker and the others who won Nobel Prizes. And the underlying assumptions of this wonderful theory is, of course, economic rationalism, that as a group we behave largely rationally. We make rational decisions, we know the probability distributions of things, we do all the calculations, we have fixed preferences and make decisions on that. We are homo economicus. And so our decision making is based on how much wealth or income we will extract, and that explains further almost all human behaviour. That's the underlying assumption of the neoliberal agenda. And it's bollocks. It's clearly bollocks, and it's been proven to be bollocks, but it continues. And what happened to it is it managed to eventually get the attention of Reagan, Thatcher and Pinochet. And we've seen the results of that. That was when, 1980, was when this theory became part of a political agenda. And those three brought it in to much human suffering, but that's not part of the equation here, brought that in, and it became the dominant, if not just the dominant, the only paradigm there is. Economic rationalism. So bad that when it led to the efficient market hypothesis, and Andy Lowe was one of the first to actually look at it technically and exhibit inefficiencies that were measurable, he was called a criminal by the guys at Chicago for daring to suggest that this was not correct. The assumptions of it are quite dangerous. The assumptions are that free markets allocate pricing and allocate capital both optimally and morally. Whether they're free is another story we can get to later. And therefore, if that's the case, it's immoral for governments to interfere with markets because they distort them. Do you ever hear anyone saying markets distort society? They distort society far more than governments distort markets. But the word distortion is already part of the agenda. It is establishing in your head that markets are the right thing, that they're pure, and anything else is a distortion of them. False. Markets are not like that. Markets are not, for instance, in equity markets, they are not like smooth-running BMWs. They're like clunky T-model Fords. But right through that, there is another, it is that sense of morality which comes from the American puritanical streak, that sense of morality. Another driver of it is that everything is for sale. Think of everything is for sale. Museums are for sale, space is for sale, silence is for sale, schools are for sale. We've forgotten the public interest, totally. And the Labor Party is partly responsible. They bought this crap too. Blair bought it, took hook, line and sinker. And we've got to attack that because that is the root cause of it all. In 1980, when that came in and everything started to be for sale, one of the outworkings of that was the Big Bang in the UK. Up until then, the brokers had fixed commissions, and now they were free to act. And the damage that's done is just enormous. Yes, there was a downside of having fixed commissions, but it meant that that's all they were doing. It was a sort of boys' club. But now the brokers, of course, do what brokers do. They flog equities, they flog anything. They'll tell you, as we saw on Wall Street only 7 years ago, how corrupt that's become because it was deregulated. The lack of regulation and the belief in this free market is a huge part of it. The main thing it leads to, of course, is that because everything is determined by how much money you make, because finance underlies the whole lot of it, it's the essence of the system, the pursuit of money is the only thing you should be after, and everything is justified. Everything, all money is justified. Think of that guy up there who was the 80 million that Moss got, and without any sense of irony, he said, no, he only got 50 million. No sense of irony. Why? Because he was entitled to it. This free market has allowed us, or allowed them, to argue the fact that we are entitled to whatever we get. And you see that sense of entitlement everywhere. You saw it only 7 years ago on Wall Street. We were going to fix it then, of course, in 2001. We did nothing. A couple of ethics courses were taught, a couple of little regulations were brought in, and nothing happened. And that's exactly what's going to happen now for reasons I'll go into. But the height of it was John Thain. You remember our dear friend John Thain at Merrill's? Amongst the other things that he did, when he got to Merrill's, he spent $2 million on fixing up his office, including $86,000 on a carpet. He saw nothing wrong with that. That was what CEOs do. And eventually the Bank of America pushed and pushed and pushed him. He's left now, but he actually came out and he said it was the wrong thing to do under these circumstances. No, he doesn't get it. It was the wrong thing to do, period, no matter what the circumstances. That is the sense of entitlement. Kozlowski at I can't remember, Tyco, he spent $6,000 on a shower curtain because he was entitled to it. We have to stop that sense that people are entitled to it. Why is Moss entitled to 50 million? I have no idea. No one is entitled to that sort of money as far as I'm concerned. And so I think Tim Costello was wrong. Tim Costello said they don't get it. No, they do get it. They do get it, and they're better organised than you. Wall Street does get it. They know they're under attack. They are right now planning how to defend that. The main defence, and they get together on it, they have got a single purpose. The main defence is keep your head down. Keep your head down. Those AIG idiots, they raised their head. What the hell were they doing? Keep your head down. Do a couple of things on the margins. Don't take a bonus this year. That'll keep everyone happy. Be good people and just keep your head down and don't do anything. And this will blow over and they'll bring in a few little regulations and we can undermine them. We got rid of Glass-Steagall after all. We got rid of Sarbanes-Oxley essentially. We'll come back and we'll undermine them. And in the meantime, we'll lobby Congress. Goldman's has increased their lobbying in Congress by a factor of 3. I'm sure Morgan's and the others have done that too. So the barbarians are outside the gate, they're licking their wounds, they're keeping their head down, and they'll be back. It'll be back again. It's only taken 6 years since the last blow-up, and we learnt nothing, absolutely nothing, because this drives all our thinking and all our behaviour. We haven't learned anything about risk management. We still think in an environment like this, we still think in terms of months and quarters. In an environment like this, you've got to think in terms of years, if not decades, and people don't want to do that. It is hard to do it, but that's the time frame you've got to adopt. And when it comes to risk, look at Rob Zink's stuff. If Rob Zink is right, if he's got a chance of being right, and for me, he's got a good chance of being right, you have to accept that there is some substantial probability that he's right. Let's call it 10%. If he's right, if his 10% chance that he's right, and you're running a fund, surely you've got to take some opportunity to hedge against that risk, that possibility. And if you don't, and it happens, what do you tell your grandchildren? Do you stand there and say, I couldn't do anything? Well, you could. And you could have done something about this last one. And then what will happen? You will be underperforming for a while, and you might lose your members. So what? If you're really interested in the benefit of your members and you're doing something that you believe is really good for them long term and some of them leave you, so what? The ones you're left with you'll do a better job for. But we are in an environment where we can't do that because of competition, and that's the other nonsense about the free market, that competition is intrinsically good. No, some competition is bad. All the 70-odd equity managers in Australia competing are bad. They are not only taking away your alpha, they are taking away your beta because they're pushing the price up. There's too much competition in the Australian equity market, and that's there because it's competition and therefore it's right. Personally, I think that's nonsense. So some of the things, just to end on, some of the things I think we should do, we've got to get rid of that model, that economic rational model, and replace it by models that turn economics into a humanist discipline, which it was. It was in the beginning with Bentham and the other great thinkers in the late, and Adam Smith. Adam Smith, just so you know, the poor old Adam Smith is being tagged with all this crap. Adam Smith's invisible hand. Adam Smith was not an idiot. Adam Smith understood that that invisible hand had limited application. And he said in his theory of moral sentiments, which is 250 years this year, and there's a new edition coming out about it, he said in there that a free market left to its own devices will ineluctably result in collusion and corruption. That's what he said, and why are we surprised that that happens? Of course it will do that. Do you think people really want to compete? They will collude, either directly or through signals. Of course they do. Managers actually compete on fees? Of course not. Why would you? There's no point in doing that. So he understood that. And what was his answer for it? His answer was, as befits an Enlightenment preacher, a Presbyterian preacher in Edinburgh in the late 18th century, we need a strong, firm, moral, ethical framework underneath to protect us. And that we don't have because economic rationalism says that is pointless. You don't make money out of it, don't bother with it. And that's what we got to, if we don't have that, we have to have regulation. So those people who are saying we shouldn't have regulation, the answer is, okay, then collectively behave ethically. Can we believe that? Can we get to that? I don't know. That raises questions about the role of agents, how many of us add value, and that's part of we're all agents. Every agent here, I think, believes we're adding value, but we know we're not. We know the others aren't, but we think we are. And that goes back to my story. We are so able to rationalise our behaviour. All agents here believe they're adding value, and most are not. And the industry needs a massive rationalisation because of that. Far too many funds, far too much choice, far too many fund managers. We need to do what Button did to the car industry back 20-odd years ago. All of that is going to need, it's an opportunity. You shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. That's what Freud said. That's the only time you get a chance to change. You don't get many chances. This is one. And the big change that should happen now is what Minsky predicted so long ago. Is another one who explained why this was going to happen. He said this is the sixth stage of capitalism. This is the stage of money market capitalism, where power has gone to the managers, not to the owners of the capital, not even to the merchants, not even to the entrepreneurs. It has been moved to the money managers. And he saw that as a wrong thing to do, and the answer is the power has to be taken back by the funds. And that's going to require collective action and courage, and therefore it ain't going to happen. So on that note, I'm just going to end with a quote so I'm rather pessimistic. I think the barbarians will come back and we won't learn anything and change anything except at the margins, and that makes us feel good. You drive into BP and it's coloured green, we think we're doing something. And that's the way the enemy actually gets to you. Yeah, let them bring in another Sarbanes-Oxley. What does it matter? We'll get rid of it. They are organised and we're not. But here is a quote from 1994, the bond market crash, from two standard but liberal American economists, Robert Heilbronner and Lester Thurow, in 1994. And they said the real challenge does not lie in our economic problems, but in the political and moral values that always enter into our economic determinations. Economics is the language we use to talk about the workings of our system, but it is not the language in which we appraise the value of the system or decide what to preserve or change. Politics and morality remain the bedrock of society. The outcome of the crisis of our times will reflect the strength of that will and the quality of those values. I think that is a wonderful line, and unfortunately we're not going to live it. And through all that, I forgot to show you my cartoons. Oh no, I didn't. So there's one. That's about, you can see that about entitlement. He's happy, the boss is happy. And then there's one about the capital strike. I can't sleep. Just got this incredible craving for capital. That's rather lovely. New Yorker does this so well. And then there was Yes We Can. Here are some headlines. Can we live these things? Welch, of all people, denounces profits obsession. Time for capitalism based on value. This is from the Financial Times, not from some left-wing rag. Fairness comes in. We know from behavioural finance it plays a role. It should come in more. So I'm just going to show you something I just got from, there is work going on this. There's a group called the Post-Autistic Economic Society, where they see what's gone on in economics as essentially autistic, and they're trying to change that. And they sent me this cartoon about TARP. That says TARP up there. I can't read the rest of it. But this is a story, a moral about TARP. So here we are. There's a car that's gone in and they're picking it up. Picking the thing up. Oh. Collapses. So we'll go back and we get a bigger one. We'll pick that up. That's all right. And then we'll pick this one up. And it collapses. And there's I'll end on there. And that was the story of TARP. Is that going to happen? Now, I should tell you, when that was sent to me, I looked at it, and if you look at it carefully, and this is really the end of the story, it's all been photoshopped. It has been doctored. It's total crap. So you can't trust anyone anymore. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're all out of time, so we won't have time for questions, which is a shame. I did have a few to ask. We'll be giving our guest speakers, as you know, instead of speaker gifts, they'll be making a donation to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in the building of 2 classrooms in Nakivale and Uganda. So, in particular, I'd like to thank both our speakers. But, Jack, I didn't know which bookshop you actually ripped off, but a managing director of one of the largest ones, Angus and Robertson, contacted me because he heard you were speaking, and he said he's been waiting 50 years with their sole last copy of Wuthering Heights sitting on the shelf, and the tension has been too much for him, so he sent it to me and asked me would I donate it to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have actually read it, and it was a great book. But I'll read it again.
Ladies and gentlemen, could you thank our speakers? Thank you.